The year is 2022. A short video surfaces on Chinese social media, only to be scrubbed from the internet almost instantly. Amid the crushing weight of the Shanghai lockdowns, a young man finds himself in a tense standoff with authorities in white hazmat suits. When threatened that his defiance would leave a permanent stain on his record and haunt his family for 3 generations, the man looks directly into the lens and calmly replies, "Sorry, we are the last generation." That statement wasn't a reckless outburst, but the spark that ignited the Renquang movement, the human fuel. The youth realized that by having children, they were merely serving as kindling for an economic engine that had already overheated. Think back to the late 90s. The air was thick with the scent of unbridled possibility. Then, every child was seen as a stake in a guaranteed future. Today, that optimism has been replaced by a cold calculation. The transition from growth at any cost to survival at any price is the defining shift of our era. Looking at Beijing's official statistics on birth rates, a common belief suggests this is simply the fallout of the one-child policy, or the sky-high cost of living. Many argue that a simple influx of cash subsidies would put the demographic machine back on track. But the burning question is, if standard economic fixes were the answer, why are these aggressive 3-child policies being met with such a chilling silence? The reality is that while an economy can be bailed out by printing money, you cannot print away a social crisis. Beneath the dry numbers lies a profound, defensive shift in consciousness. What is truly staggering is that this resistance is completely silent. No protests, no riots. This is a ghost strike, where the youth are dismantling their own motivation to build as a means of self-preservation, shattering the trust in a prosperous future that has been marketed to them for decades. 30 years ago, China was a giant waking up, where every sacrifice felt like a stepping stone to glory. Now, the giant is tired. The youth aren't just exhausted by labor, they are exhausted by the realization that the prosperity of the past was built on a foundation of massive debt, and they are now the ones expected to pay the price in the future. And while this shift is unfolding inside China, the rest of the world has begun to take notice. In May 2025, the UK signed its largest trade deal since Brexit with India. At first glance, this event seems completely unrelated to the young people in China refusing to marry or have children. But the timing is telling. Trade between the UK and India was already worth about £47.2 billion annually. Yet, London wanted more. The UK government estimates the new deal could boost bilateral trade by roughly £25.5 billion in the long run, while adding about £4.8 billion to the UK economy. This isn't just a trade deal. It's a sign that economies are proactively seeking new sources of growth. Because as more young people in China quietly withdraw from the model that defined their country for 2 decades, a question is emerging not just in Beijing, but in London, in Brussels, and in Washington. What happens if China's youth no longer want to play the game their parents played? Because if a generation no longer believes that buying a home, marrying, and having children will lead to a better life, then the problem is no longer just demographic. It's about the very engine that has driven China's economy for decades. And to understand why that question has the whole world watching, we need to go back to where it all began: the Chinese real estate market. Consider the case of Wang Li, a 32-year-old programmer in Beijing. He once worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, following the grueling 996 formula. He did everything society demanded to chase the Chinese dream. But after 10 years of grinding, his savings couldn't even cover a third of an apartment on the outskirts of the city. Wang Li and his generation are experiencing a bitter awakening. The reward for their hard work isn't prosperity, but total exhaustion. The collapse isn't found in the financial headlines about Evergrande, but in the silent withdrawal of people exactly like Wang Li. There was a time when the iron rice bowl represented stability, and the subsequent market opening represented mobility. Wang Li's father climbed the ladder easily. Wang Li finds that the ladder has been pulled up. The gap isn't just about income, it's about the erosion of the belief that effort equals elevation. The further one follows the trail, the clearer the macroeconomic paradox becomes. A failing financial system can be bailed out by printing money. But when a nation collapses completely regarding its internal will to live, is there any central bank in the world capable of printing hope? To find the answer, look at the concrete blocks. In the Tongcheng district, on the outskirts of Zhengzhou, once a symbol of prosperity with 30-story towers, everything is now a gray, eerie, concrete graveyard. These are Lanwei projects, rotting tail buildings. Many people still believe this is just a real estate crisis. That after a few bailouts, after a few rounds of interest rate cuts, everything will return to the way it was. But it's notable that the rest of the world isn't acting as if that's a certainty. In recent years, more governments and corporations have begun searching for new consumer markets outside of China. A prime example is India. Long-term projections suggest its total import demand could reach approximately £2.8 trillion by 2050, a figure large enough to command the attention of policymakers from London to Brussels. This doesn't mean India will replace China, but it reveals a different reality. Even while the real estate crisis persists inside China, many outside have already begun preparing for a world where growth is no longer as dependent on China as it once was. This collapse isn't happening on the digital stock tickers. It is unfolding in the desperate, literal footsteps of ordinary people. Contrast this with the era of infrastructure booms, where every bridge built was a testament to national pride. Now, those same bridges serve as monuments to phantom growth. In an 18th floor apartment of an unfinished, windowless building, Li Na, a 27-year-old finance graduate, cooks instant noodles on a portable gas stove. She is a rotten tail kid, a term for the youth who drained their own savings, and that of 3 generations of their family to buy a home, only to receive a hollow, concrete frame in return. Every month, Li Na still has to set aside half her salary to pay debt for a ruin. Her moment of clarity came on a winter night, looking through a windowless frame at the glittering lights of the corporate center, while her own home remained shrouded in darkness. The contrast revealed the brutal truth. The system doesn't protect the worker, it only protects its own cash flow. In the past, property was a ladder for the middle class. Today, it has become an anchor that drags them into the abyss. The generational shift is clear. Where once there was home ownership, now there is only mortgage slavery. The old model operated on a simple promise. Tomorrow will be better than today. Home prices will keep rising. Income will keep rising. And each generation will live better than the last. But as the lights in these ghost districts flick out one by one, that promise has begun to vanish too. The most frightening thing isn't the unfinished buildings. It isn't the overdue loans. It's the disappearance of trust. For many years, the Chinese people were willing to work harder, save more, sacrifice more, because they believed the future would be better than the present. But for people like Li Na, that future seems to have been mortgaged along with the home she never received. And when millions of people start questioning the very promise that drove an entire economy, this crisis is no longer just about real estate. It becomes a crisis of faith. And when faith starts to fracture, the entire growth model begins to wobble alongside it. To understand why the Chinese economic engine cannot hit the brakes, look at the balance sheet of Guizhou, a mountainous province with over 31 million people. Its total public debt exceeds $130 billion, more than the province's entire annual GDP combined. Western analysts believe that superior infrastructure is the core foundation to maintain the status of the world's factory. They argue this investment creates long-term profit by optimizing logistics. But here's the kicker. When digging into the internal reports of local shadow debt funds, the truth is exactly the opposite. Look at the Zhajiahe Bridge in Guizhou. Construction costs were hundreds of millions of dollars. Traffic flow reports indicate the daily toll revenue isn't enough to cover 1/10 of the daily interest payments on the bank loans for the project. Think about it. Over 60% of infrastructure projects in the western provinces after 2015 have no ability to operate financially. The miracle was sold on the idea of efficiency. But looking at Guizhou today, one sees that we traded long-term sustainability for short-term vanity. The difference between the 90s build-out and today's construction is simple. We used to build to connect. Now we build to inflate GDP, and that is the problem. When the scale of debt becomes large enough, it's no longer just an internal Chinese affair. What happens within the world's second-largest economy begins to create ripples far beyond its borders. But perhaps the most notable sign isn't in Guizhou. It isn't Evergrande. And it isn't the ghost cities. It's in how the rest of the world is reacting. For decades, global economies were accustomed to viewing China as a near-default growth engine. When China built, the world sold raw materials. When China consumed, the world sold finished goods. But as that engine begins to decelerate, other nations are starting to look for new options. After the deal with India, the UK continued to finalize trade agreements with the GCC, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. The UK government estimates this agreement could contribute about £3.7 billion annually to the country's economy. Roughly 93% of British exports to the GCC will be tariff-free. Meanwhile, about £580 million in tariffs are expected to be eliminated each year. At first glance, this is just another trade deal, but at a deeper level, it reflects a shift in global economic thinking. Governments are no longer focused solely on accessing the Chinese market. They are actively seeking new growth engines, new sources of demand, and new partners. Because if the world's second-largest economy is no longer growing like it used to, the entire global economic map will have to change too. The truth was far worse. When banks tightened the credit valve due to systemic risks, the forced growth machine ran on empty. Localities began cutting civil servant salaries and medical subsidies. The treadmill slowed down and hit a solid wall. The silence of the next generation. Come to the office towers of Zhongguancun, Beijing's Silicon Valley. It is 11 p.m., and the windows are still glowing. Behind the light, it is not creativity, but systemic extraction. He system forces young people to dedicate their youth in exchange for a salary that is sucked dry by rent and future real estate mortgage debts. We used to speak of human capital. Today, it feels more like human consumables. The shift from the 90s dream of making it big to the current reality of just surviving is the most profound collapse of national morale in modern history. In a sociological report by Tsinghua University, experts recorded an unprecedented wave of defensive consciousness shifting. On platforms like Douban and Jihu, a life philosophy has spread like a virus. Tang Ping, or lying flat. Lying flat is not laziness. It is a silent strike. Young people actively choose to give up buying homes, marrying, having children, and even advancing their careers. When realizing they are just fuel in a macroeconomic Ponzi scheme, the youth find their ultimate weapon, refusing to step into the furnace. The old generation remembers the hunger of the past and appreciates the progress. The new generation remembers the exhaustion of the present and questions the purpose. This fundamental gap in experience is why the system's old tools of control no longer work. But not everyone chooses to lie flat. Chen Hao, 29, used to run a small tutoring center. When the double reduction policy appeared, the industry was tightened almost overnight. Instead of finding a new job, Chen Hao returned to his hometown, grew vegetables, and sold them online. His answer was, "I don't want to continue participating in a race where the final reward is only exhaustion." When the lying flat wave combined with a youth unemployment rate exceeding 20%, Beijing realized it faced an unprecedented crisis. When millions of young people declare in unison, "Sorry, we are the last generation," that is a structural breaking point. Social trust, once broken, does not recover at the speed of GDP growth. It recovers by generation. If house prices are out of reach, working hours extend to night, and educational pressure starts from kindergarten, then money cannot force people to hope. Beijing tries to re-establish control. Many scholars believe banning the tutoring industry or tightening the grip on tech is a genius move to redistribute wealth. But perhaps the clearest sign that the problem has transcended China's borders is what's happening in global trade. As China's domestic demand weakens, Beijing relies more heavily on exports to maintain growth. This has caused major trade partners to start reacting. In the United States, tariffs on certain steel products have been raised to 50%. Meanwhile, the European Union is preparing countermeasures against roughly 26 billion euros worth of goods related to transatlantic trade disputes. The consequences have begun to appear in real-world data. European steel exports to the US previously saw a decline of about 34%. At first glance, these may seem like familiar trade arguments, but at a deeper level, they reflect a larger restructuring as nations increasingly lose faith that the global economy will continue to operate by the rules that existed for the past 2 decades. And at the center of that change is the question of the future of the world's second-largest growth engine. And that is also when China's real estate crisis is no longer just a story about housing. It becomes a story about the limits of a growth model that has defined the global economy for decades. Because as that model begins to slow down, it isn't just China that changes. The entire world has to change with it. It is the final assertion regarding the limits of human ambition. We are witnessing the final chapter of a 30-year grand experiment. The difference between then and now is the difference between a society in ascent and a society in retreat. In the past, the system could point to a new apartment or a new highway to justify the sacrifice of the individual. But the youth of today have seen the concrete turn to dust, and the highways lead to empty valleys. They are not looking for a better deal, they are looking for a way out. The miracle was built on the assumption of infinite expansion. But life is finite. When the human spirit realizes it has been used as a tool rather than treated as an end, the game changes. The era of blind ambition has ended, replaced by the era of quiet, painful, and necessary reflection. We aren't just watching an economy cool down. We are watching a whole generation redefine what it means to be human, in a system that stopped being human a long time ago.